What if the greatest treasure in the world wasn't buried under the sand or locked in a vault? What if it was hidden in plain sight, walking past you every single day, completely invisible? We are told to look for opportunity in grand gestures, in loud announcements, in shining signals from the universe. But the most profound changes, the ones that reshape destinies and build empires, often begin with a whisper. They begin in the quietest corners, under the dimmest lights, in the heart of someone the world has already decided to forget. This is a story about a whisper that became a roar. It is the story of a woman who was invisible, and the man who finally learned how to see. Her name was Alara, and her story begins, as so many do, in the dark. The only light she knew was the cold, artificial glow of empty offices after midnight. She was a ghost in the machine of modern finance, a cleaner for Thorn Investments, the most powerful trading firm in the city. Her world was a muffled symphony of rolling trash cans, the squeak of a mop on polished marble, and the hum of servers processing billions of dollars she would never touch. The building was a steel and glass titan, piercing the clouds, a monument to ambition. But Alara's domain was the forgotten spaces within it. The dust bunnies under desks, the smudges on the glass partitions, the stale coffee rings on conference tables. She wore a faded gray uniform that seemed to absorb the light, rendering her just another shadow in a building full of them. Her life was a ledger of subtractions. Her father's passing, her mother's mounting medical bills, the slow erosion of her own dreams. Each night, she moved through the silent battleground of the global economy, cleaning up the day's debris. But Alara had a secret, a profound and beautiful secret that she kept locked away behind tired eyes. As she wiped down the rows of dormant computer screens, the residual flickers of data spoke to her. The stock tickers, the market graphs, the endless columns of numbers, they weren't just data. To her, they were a language, a living, breathing language she had somehow always understood. The rising and falling of a stock wasn't a percentage point. It was a sentence, full of intent and emotion. A market crash wasn't a financial event. It was a scream. A bull run was a triumphant song. She could read the rhythm of the world's wealth, feel its grammar, and see the subtle misspellings that preceded a catastrophe. She would pause her cart, her gaze lost in a screen, and trace the patterns with a gloved finger, her mind deciphering the complex poetry of global capital. It was a gift she could share with no one, a fluency in a language no one else knew existed. It was useless, she thought, a beautiful, tragic, useless secret. What good was knowing the language of money when you were drowning in the lack of it? What good was seeing the future when you were trapped in a past you couldn't escape? She was the custodian of secrets in more ways than one, tidying the physical world while her mind communed with an invisible one. The contrast was a quiet ache in her soul. The men and women who worked here in their tailored suits shouted numbers into phones, their faces tight with stress, guessing, gambling, praying. And she, in her worn-out shoes, could simply read the answer. But they would never ask her. They didn't even see her. She was just the cleaner, the silent, invisible woman who made their world pristine so they could return the next day to throw it back into chaos. And every night, she would finish her shift, walk out of the gleaming lobby, and disappear into the pre-dawn gloom, her extraordinary gift a silent, heavy weight in her heart. But a secret like hers could not stay buried forever. Because in the penthouse office of that very building, a king on a lonely throne was facing a problem that all the money in the world couldn't solve. And soon, his world and the world of the invisible woman were destined to collide. The man in the penthouse was Julian Thorn. To the world, he was not a man but a symbol. The heir to the Thorn Investments empire, he had inherited his father's legendary name and a crushing weight of expectation. The media had christened him the Ice King of Wall Street, a name earned through a series of ruthless, almost clairvoyant market predictions that had doubled the firm's value in 5 years. He was a figure of cold, calculating genius, his face a mask of detached indifference, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He lived in a world of panoramic views and sterile silence. The city lights a carpet of jewels laid out at his feet. But the throne was a lonely one, and the crown was heavy. Tonight, the The silence in his office was not peaceful. It was suffocating. It was filled with the ghost of his father and the roar of an impending failure. For a month, he had been locked in a battle with the market, a complex, volatile beast he could no longer predict. A proprietary trading algorithm, his masterpiece and the cornerstone of the firm's recent success, was failing. It was bleeding money slowly at first and now hemorrhaging. He and his team of the brightest minds money could buy had taken it apart and put it back together 100 times. They had run every diagnostic, every simulation. Nothing. It was a flaw so subtle, so deeply embedded in the logic, that it was invisible to them all. The pressure was immense. The board was whispering. His rivals were circling like sharks, sensing blood in the water. The legacy his father had built, the empire he was sworn to protect, was teetering on the brink of a single, unsolvable equation. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling whiteboard that covered an entire wall of his office. It was a chaotic tapestry of code, mathematical formulas, and frantic diagrams. It was the anatomy of his failure, laid bare in black and red marker. He stared at it, his jaw tight, his reflection a faint, ghostly image on the glass. He felt a weariness that went bone deep, a frustration so sharp it was almost a physical pain. He was Julian Thorne. He did not fail. But the whiteboard mocked him, a testament to his fallibility. He saw the numbers, the variables, the logical gates. He saw the code. But he couldn't see the answer. It was like trying to read a book in a language he almost knew, where one wrong word, one misplaced comma, rendered the entire text meaningless. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disrupting its order. It was a small act of chaos in a life built on control. The Ice King was beginning to melt. He picked up a marker, his knuckles white, and drew a furious line through a block of code, a gesture of pure frustration. Changed nothing. He was blind. He was lost. Defeated for the night, he grabbed his coat, leaving the lights on, leaving the monument to his struggle on the wall for all to see. He walked out of the office, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, the sound echoing the closing of a door in his own mind. He didn't know it, but he had just left the key to his kingdom lying on the table, waiting for the one person in the world who could turn it. He had left his unsolvable problem in the path of the only person who could read its hidden language. And she was just now wheeling her cleaning cart down the silent, empty hallway, heading straight for his door. Alara pushed open the heavy glass door to the CEO's office, the sanctum sanctorum of Thorne Investments. The air inside was different, charged with a quiet intensity, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and ozone from the humming technology. It was the one room she both dreaded and was fascinated by. It felt like the epicenter of the entire building, the heart from which all the frantic energy flowed. Tonight, the lights were still on, casting a stark glow on the vast space. Her eyes were immediately drawn to the whiteboard. It was a chaotic mural of failure, a frantic scrawl of genius hitting a wall. Most nights, she would simply wipe such boards clean, erasing the day's battles. But this was different. This wasn't just numbers and symbols. To Alara, it was a paragraph, a long, complex, and deeply troubled sentence. She approached it cautiously, her cleaning cart forgotten by the door. Her gaze scanned the lines of code, the mathematical proofs. Her mind didn't process them logically. It felt them. She read the flow, the rhythm, the cadence of the argument the writer was trying to make. And just like a master linguist spotting a subtle grammatical error in a dense academic text, she saw it. It was a tiny thing, a single variable in a recursive loop. The logic was structured like a question that kept asking itself, but the variable was positioned in a way that it was always answering with a slight, almost imperceptible lie. This lie, repeated millions of times a second, was slowly corrupting the entire system. It was a misplaced clause, a syntactical error. It was screamingly obvious to her, as obvious as a misspelled word in a headline. She knew she shouldn't. It was not her place. Her job was to erase, not to create, to clean, not to solve. Touching it was a cardinal sin, an overreach so profound it could cost her the job she so desperately needed. She looked at the door, her heart pounding. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, the pale, tired skin, the hope in her eyes that Alara tried so hard not to extinguish. Fired. The word echoed in the silent room. But then she looked back at the board. The error was an offense to her senses. It was a discordant note in a beautiful symphony. It was wrong. It was a cry for help written in a language only she could understand. Her hand trembled as she reached for a blue marker left on the ledge. Felt heavy like a scepter. With a swift, certain motion, she drew a single, elegant line, moving the variable from one side of the equation to the other. She didn't add anything. She didn't erase anything. She just corrected the grammar. She shifted one word. The entire meaning of the paragraph changed. The question was no longer lying to itself. Now it could find the truth. She capped the marker, her breath held tight in her chest. The change was almost invisible in the sea of black and red ink. A single blue line, a whisper of a correction. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Grabbing her cart, she quickly finished her duties in the office, her movements clumsy and rushed. She emptied the trash, wiped the desk, and fled the room, shutting the door behind her with a soft click. As she continued her rounds, she tried to forget it, to push the image of the whiteboard from her mind. It was a moment of madness, a foolish, reckless impulse. No one would ever notice. It would be erased by the morning crew, and Julian Thorne would never know. But she was wrong. Julian returned less than an hour later, a file forgotten on his desk. He walked in, his mind still churning, and his eyes fell upon the whiteboard. He stopped dead. First, he didn't see it. The board was exactly as he'd left it, a landscape of his own frustration. But then, a flicker of color caught his eye. A single, thin blue line. It was so small, so insignificant. He stepped closer, his brow furrowed. He followed the line, saw the variable it had moved. And then the world stopped. The air left his lungs. It was like a key turning in a lock he didn't even know was there. The shift in position, that one simple move, it recontextualized everything. It didn't just fix the loop. It unlocked a new dimension of the algorithm's capability. It was not a correction. It was a revelation. It was elegant. It was brilliant. It was the work of an absolute genius. A cold shock ran down his spine. Who had been in his office? His team had all gone home hours ago. No one on his staff, not even his top quants, had seen this. They had all looked at this exact problem and declared it impossible. Who had this key? He felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal thrill of the hunt. This wasn't just about fixing the algorithm anymore. This was about finding the mind that could see what he could not. He strode to his desk and hit the intercom button for security. His voice was low and urgent, the ice in his tone replaced by a burning fire. Get me the security footage for this office for the last hour. Now the game had changed. The Ice King was no longer hunting for a flaw in his code. He was hunting for a ghost with a brilliant, beautiful mind. Julian sat in the darkened security office, his eyes glued to a bank of monitors. The security chief, a burly man named Frank, stood nervously beside him. Mr. Thorne, I assure you, no one unauthorized entered your office. The access logs are clean. Julian didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the screen showing the hallway outside his penthouse suite. He fast-forwarded the footage, his finger tapping impatiently on the console. He saw himself leaving. Then, for 20 long minutes, the hallway was empty, a silent, sterile corridor. He was about to dismiss it as a fluke, a trick of his tired mind, when a figure appeared at the far end of the hall. It was a woman pushing a cleaning cart. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her head down, just another part of the building's nocturnal ecosystem. Julian leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The woman stopped at his door, swiped a low-level access card, and disappeared inside. Frank cleared his throat. That's just Alara Vance. Night crew. She's been with us for 2 years. Clean record. Julian ignored him. His entire focus was on the small, grainy image of the woman inside his office. He watched as she emptied the trash. He watched as she wiped his desk. And then he saw her pause. He saw her walk to the whiteboard. He watched, spellbound, as this cleaner, this invisible woman in a gray uniform, stood before his life's work, his greatest failure. He saw her tilt her head, as if listening to a faint melody. And then he saw her hand, small and gloved, pick up the blue marker. He watched her make the single, confident stroke. The stroke that had saved his company. He rewound the footage and watched it again. And again. It was impossible. It was absurd. It was undeniable. He looked at the woman on the screen, really looked at her for the first time. There was a quiet grace in her movements, a focused intensity in her posture as she studied the board. This wasn't a random guess. This wasn't a lucky doodle. This was insight. What do you know about her? Julian asked, his voice a low growl. Frank shuffled his feet. Not much, sir. Keeps to herself. Single. Lives out in the burrows. I think her mother is sick. That's all I know. Julian stood up, his mind racing. Cleaner. A woman with a sick mother and a low-level access card held the key to a problem that had stumped a room full of PhDs from MIT. The absurdity of it was staggering. The beauty of it was breathtaking. The next night, he waited. He sent his staff home, turned off the lights in his office, and sat in the adjoining private conference room. The door cracked just enough to see his whiteboard. He felt a ridiculous sense of anticipation, like a hunter waiting in a blind. Hours passed. The building grew quiet. Finally, he heard the soft rattle of her cart in the hallway. The door opened, and she slipped inside, as silent as a sigh. She began her routine, moving with that same weary efficiency he'd seen on the tape. He watched her, a predator studying its prey. When she moved towards the whiteboard, his heart began to pound. She glanced at it, and he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear? Regret? She reached for her cleaning cloth, as if to wipe it all away. Don't, Julian said, his voice cutting through the silence. Alara froze, her hand hovering over the board. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, like a deer caught in headlights. She saw him standing in the doorway, a tall, imposing silhouette against the hallway light. Julian Thorne, the Ice King himself. She thought her life was over. I'm so sorry, sir, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I know I shouldn't have touched it. I'll leave. You don't have to fire me. I'll just go. Julian stepped into the room, flicking on the main lights. The sudden brightness made her flinch. He walked towards her, his gaze intense, pinning her in place. He stopped in front of the whiteboard, his eyes not on her, but on the single blue line. I'm not going to fire you, he said, his voice softer than she could have ever imagined. He turned to face her, his expression a mixture of awe and utter confusion. I want you to tell me how you did it. Tell me how you saw that. Alara stared at him, bewildered. This wasn't the reaction she expected. There was no anger, no condescension. Only a raw, burning curiosity. I don't know, she whispered, her hands twisting the hem of her uniform. It just looked wrong. Julian's eyes narrowed. Wrong how? This is a multi-layered recursive algorithm based on quantum modeling. It's not a sentence. You can't just look at it and see a flaw. The fear in Alara's chest began to subside, replaced by a frantic need to explain, to make him understand it wasn't a fluke. But it is a sentence, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. She took a hesitant step towards the board. This part here, she pointed to the original code. It's asking a question, but the structure, the syntax, it's forcing the answer to be a contradiction. It's like writing, what is the color of the sky on a sunny day? And then forcing the answer to be green every time. Eventually, the whole story you're writing stops making sense. Julian listened, utterly captivated. He had spent his life talking to the most brilliant financial minds in the world, men and women who spoke in complex jargon and arcane mathematics. But he had never heard anyone describe his work with such simple, profound clarity. She saw his code as poetry. She saw his failure as a grammatical error. And my change? He prompted gently. The blue line. I just fixed the grammar, she said, looking at him with earnest, pleading eyes. I moved the clause so the question could find its own true answer. The sky is blue. Now the story can continue. Julian was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting from her face to the board and back again. He saw the worn fabric of her uniform, the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the raw, untapped intelligence shining within them. The world saw a cleaner. He was looking at a prodigy. He had spent a fortune trying to find a mind like this, and she was here all along, polishing his floors. The irony was staggering. He made a decision. It was insane. It was reckless. It was the most brilliant idea he'd ever had. "I have a proposition for you, Alara," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. "A 1-month contract. You work with me, directly. On this," he gestured to the board. "I'll pay you 10 times what you make in a year. If we solve the larger problem, the one this algorithm is meant to address, you will receive a bonus of $5 million." Alara's world tilted on its axis. Her mind couldn't process the number. $5 million. It was an abstraction, a fairy tale sum. It would save her mother. It would change everything. It was impossible. "Sir, I'm a cleaner," she stammered. "I don't have a degree. I don't know anything about finance." "You know how to read," Julian said, his eyes boring into hers. "You know how to read a language no one else here can even hear. That's all I need." The next morning, Julian Thorne walked into his morning briefing with his senior staff, and the world of Thorne Investments was turned upside down. Beside him, looking small and terrified in a simple, ill-fitting suit Julian had his assistant procure, was Alara. The room, filled with the sharpest, most arrogant minds in finance, fell silent. All eyes went to her. Marcus Vance, a senior vice president with hungry eyes and a predatory smile, was the first to speak. He was a man who had clawed his way up the corporate ladder and viewed Julian's position not with loyalty, but with envy. He had been his father's protege and felt he, not the son, was the true heir to the throne. "Julian," Marcus began, his voice dripping with condescending concern, "is this some kind of joke?" Julian's gaze was glacial. "This is Alara Vance. She will be joining us as a consultant for the next month, working directly with me on Project Chimera." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Project Chimera was the code name for the failing algorithm, a closely guarded secret. "A consultant?" Marcus scoffed, making no effort to hide his disdain as he looked Alara up and down, taking in her cheap shoes and nervous posture. "With all due respect, what are her qualifications? I don't believe I've seen her resume. Did she come from Goldman? J.P. Morgan?" "Her qualifications are her own," Julian said flatly, his tone a clear warning. "She has a perspective we lack. She will have full access." Marcus laughed, a short, barking sound. "Full access? Julian, we are talking about the core of our firm's intellectual property. You can't just bring in a temp and show her everything. The board will have your head." David Chun, Julian's oldest friend and the firm's chief legal counsel, placed a calming hand on Julian's arm. David was a pragmatist, a man who saw the world in terms of risk and liability. He was the only one in the room who could speak to Julian with such familiarity. "Julian, perhaps we should discuss this in private," David said quietly. "Marcus has a point, however poorly he's making it. The optics on this are challenging." Julian looked from David's worried face to Marcus's smug one, then to the bewildered faces of his team. Finally, his eyes rested on Alara. She was staring at the floor, her shoulders hunched, trying to make herself invisible again. He saw her not as a risk, but as the only way forward. He had followed the rules his whole life. He had hired the best graduates from the best schools. He had trusted the established wisdom, and it had led him to a dead end. This woman, this anomaly, was his rebellion. "There is nothing to discuss," Julian announced to the room, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Alara is here on my authority. You will give her your full cooperation. Is that understood?" The room fell into a tense, resentful silence. Marcus Vance stared at Julian, his eyes glittering with a mixture of disbelief and fury. He saw this not just as a foolish business decision, but as a personal insult. He had given 20 years of his life to this firm, and Julian was pinning his hopes on a janitor. It was a humiliation. He would not let it stand. He would watch and he would wait, and when this mad experiment inevitably blew up in Julian's face, he would be there to pick up the pieces. And the crown. Alara's first day felt less like a job and more like a public execution. The open-plan trading floor was a cavernous space, a jungle of screens and blinking lights, humming with a nervous energy that was almost a physical force. The air crackled with tension and testosterone. When she walked through it with Julian, a hush fell over the room. Hundreds of pairs of eyes followed her, the whispers trailing behind her like the train of a funeral gown. They saw her borrowed suit that hung slightly too loose, her worn-out handbag, her terrified eyes. They saw a stray, a curiosity, an affront to their world of Ivy League degrees and seven-figure bonuses. Julian installed her at a vacant terminal right in the heart of the floor, a space usually reserved for senior analysts. It was a deliberate statement, a throne in the lion's den. He gave her a brief overview of their systems and then was called away to a meeting, leaving her alone, exposed, and utterly out of her depth. The moment he was gone, the atmosphere shifted. The whispers grew louder. The smirks became more open. Marcus Vance sauntered over, a few of his sycophants in tow. He leaned against her desk, a predatory grin on his face. "Welcome to the big leagues, Alara," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire section to hear. "Feeling a little out of your element? Don't worry, we'll get you up to speed." He gestured to one of his junior analysts. "Pull up the raw data from the Argentinian sovereign debt crisis of '01. All of it. Let's give our new consultant something to chew on." The junior analyst's eyes widened. It was a notoriously complex data set, a chaotic mess that had taken their best teams weeks to untangle. It was a hazing ritual, a test designed for public failure. The screens in front of Alara filled with a tidal wave of information. Numbers, charts, news feeds, and historical data swirled in a dizzying cascade. It was an avalanche of pure chaos, meant to intimidate and overwhelm. The traders around her leaned back in their chairs, folding their arms, ready for the show. Marcus stood over her, his arms crossed, the smug grin never leaving his face. "See anything interesting in there, Alara?" he sneered. "Any grammatical errors?" The question was met with a few stifled snickers. Alara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Her hands trembled on the keyboard. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this place and return to the quiet anonymity of the night. But then, she looked at the screens. She forced herself to ignore the whispers, the condescending stares, the crushing weight of expectation. She forced herself to breathe, and she began to read. To her, the chaotic data wasn't just numbers. It was the frantic, panicked shouting of a dying economy. It was a story of fear, corruption, and desperation. The usual patterns of market language were there, but they were twisted, broken, filled with non sequiturs and contradictions. Most people saw noise. She saw a narrative. She saw the lies the government was telling in their official reports, starkly contrasted with the terrified screams of the bond yields. She saw the secret conversations happening in the currency exchange rates, a coded language of capital flight. Her fingers began to move across the keyboard, not with the frantic energy of a trader, but with the calm, deliberate pace of a scholar translating an ancient text. She pulled up disparate streams of information, placing them side by side. A shipping manifest from a port in Buenos Aires, a weather report from the farming plains, a transcript of a minor politician's speech. To everyone else, they were unrelated data points. To her, they were the footnotes that explained the main text. She lost all track of time. The noise of the trading floor faded into a distant hum. The smirking faces around her disappeared. It was just her and the language. After what felt like an eternity, she stopped. She leaned back, her eyes clear and focused. She had read the story. She understood its tragic ending. Marcus, growing impatient, tapped on her desk. "Well, have you solved the mysteries of the universe yet?" Alara turned to him, her gaze direct, all fear gone. replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty. The final collapse wasn't triggered by the currency default, she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the noise. Everyone thinks it was. But that was just a symptom. The real trigger was here. She pointed to a tiny, almost invisible data point on one of the screens. It was a report on rainfall totals in the Pampas region. There was a drought, she explained, worse than anyone reported. It destroyed the soybean harvest. Soybeans were the peg for hundreds of derivative contracts. The government was hiding the agricultural reports, but the truth was written in the commodity futures. It was a whisper. The market was whispering about a famine, but everyone was too busy listening to the government shouting about currency. They were reading the wrong book. A profound silence fell over the surrounding desks. The traders who had been smirking were now leaning forward, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. They had all studied this crisis. They had all accepted the common wisdom. No one had ever made this connection. It was too obscure, too subtle. Marcus stared at the screen, his face paling slightly. He opened his mouth to retort, to find a flaw, but he couldn't. The logic was simple. The evidence was there, hidden in plain sight. It was elegant. It was brilliant. And it was terrifying. For the first time, he looked at Alara and didn't see a cleaner. He saw a threat. A genuine, unpredictable, and powerful threat. Julian returned to find the trading floor in a state of stunned silence. All eyes on Alara's terminal. He saw the data on her screen and understood immediately what Marcus had tried to do. He looked at Marcus, whose face was a mask of cold fury, and then at Alara, who sat calmly amidst the wreckage of a 20-year-old financial crisis she had just solved in under an hour. A slow smile spread across Julian's face. The gamble was paying off. He had found his ghost, and she was more brilliant than he had ever dared to imagine. The next few weeks were a blur. Julian cleared his schedule, dedicating himself entirely to working with Alara. They spent their days locked in his office, the whiteboard now a pristine canvas for their collaboration. He would explain the complex mechanics of the market, the intricate architecture of his algorithms. He spoke the language of math and finance. She would listen, her head tilted, and then translate it back to him in her own language, the language of stories, of grammar, of intent. She saw things he never could. While his team focused on macro trends and quantitative analysis, she focused on the outliers, the anomalies, the whispers. She taught him to listen for the market's secrets. "It's lying here," she would say, pointing to a graph that looked perfectly stable to him. "The words are right, but the tone is wrong. There's fear underneath." Slowly, they began to piece together the puzzle of Project Chimera. The original flaw she had found was only the beginning. The real problem was deeper. The global economy was shifting in a way that the old models couldn't account for. A new financial bubble was forming, but it wasn't in real estate or tech stocks, the places everyone was looking. It was somewhere hidden, somewhere obscure, in a sector so boring and stable that no one paid it any attention. Global logistics and shipping. Alara saw it first. She saw it in the subtle, almost imperceptible increase in the cost of shipping insurance. She saw it in the language of futures contracts for industrial lubricants. She saw it in the anxious chatter of satellite data tracking container ship movements. To her, it was a story building towards a devastating climax. A perfect storm of rising fuel costs, a bottleneck in a critical strait, and a series of over-leveraged companies had created a house of cards. A single gust of wind would bring it all down. "The whole system is about to have a heart attack," she told Julian, her voice low and urgent. "And no one is listening to the chest pains." Julian ran the simulations. He had his team backtest her theory. The data, when viewed through her lens, was undeniable. It was a catastrophe in the making, and a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The firm could make a fortune by betting against the sector, shorting the stocks of the most vulnerable companies. But it was a massive risk. It meant going against the entire market, against every major analyst, against all conventional wisdom. It was the kind of bet that could either make him a legend or destroy Thorne Investments forever. He convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff. Alara stood beside him as he laid out the strategy. The room was thick with skepticism. It was Marcus Vance who once again led the opposition. "This is madness, Julian," he exclaimed, his voice shaking with rage. "You're going to bet the entire firm on the feelings of a janitor? On a theory based on the price of lubricant? This isn't analysis. It's witchcraft. The board will never approve it. I will personally see to it that they don't." Julian's gaze was like ice. "You don't have to worry about the board, Marcus. I'm using the discretionary fund. My personal capital and the firm's risk capital. Board approval is not required." A collective gasp went through the room. The discretionary fund was Julian's ultimate weapon. A massive pool of capital he controlled absolutely. Using it on a move this risky was unprecedented. It was a declaration of war against the establishment, against his own team. David Chun pulled him aside as the meeting broke up in disarray. "Julian, think about what you're doing," his friend pleaded. "If you're wrong, you won't just lose money. You'll lose the firm. They'll oust you. Your father's legacy will be gone. Is this woman, this feeling worth that?" Julian looked across the room at Alara. She was watching him, her expression not of fear, but of quiet, unwavering belief. In that moment, he realized this was about more than money. It was about trusting a kind of truth that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. It was about trusting her. "Yes," Julian said to David. His voice filled with a certainty that surprised even himself. "She is." He walked back to Alara. "We're doing it," he said. "We're making the bet." The order was placed. Billions of dollars were staked on Alara's whisper. The die was cast. But Marcus Vance was not a man to accept defeat. He saw Julian's move not as a bold strategy, but as an act of self-destruction, and he was determined to be the one holding the knife. That evening, he made a phone call to a contact he had cultivated for years, a ruthless tabloid journalist known for destroying careers. "I have a story for you," Marcus purred into the phone. "The Ice King of Wall Street has finally lost his mind. And you'll never guess who's pulling his strings." The next morning, the storm broke. The story was everywhere, a digital wildfire. The headline was brutal. "Madman of Wall Street bets billions on cleaners, voodoo economics." The article painted a scathing picture of Julian as an unhinged egomaniac, and Alara as a mystical charlatan, a Cinderella Svengali, who had somehow bewitched the city's most powerful man. It was filled with quotes from anonymous insiders at the firm, detailing her background, mocking her linguistic theories, and portraying Julian's bet as a symptom of a mental breakdown. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The firm's stock plummeted on the opening bell. Panicked investors started pulling their funds. The board called an emergency meeting. The phones rang off the hook with calls from furious clients. Julian and Alara were besieged. They arrived at the office to a mob of reporters and television cameras. They were trapped, the architects of their own public crucifixion. Inside, the trading floor was a scene of pure chaos. The mood was mutinous. Marcus Vance walked the floor like a conquering hero, accepting sympathetic words from traders who now saw him as the firm's only hope for salvation. He had timed his betrayal perfectly. By leaking the story before the market could prove Alara right or wrong, he had created a crisis of confidence so severe that Julian would be forced out regardless of the outcome. In the eye of the hurricane, in Julian's office, there was a strange calm. Alara stared out the window at the city below, her face pale. "They made me sound like a fool," she whispered. Like a joke, Julian came to stand beside her. He had aged a decade in a few hours, but his eyes were clear. "Don't listen to them," he said, his voice low but firm. "They're just scared. People always mock what they don't understand. But what if I'm wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if I've ruined you?" He turned her to face him, his hands resting gently on her arms. For the first time, their connection felt like more than just business. In this moment of shared crisis, they were just a man and a woman, standing together against the world. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," he said, his gaze holding hers. "I don't believe in voodoo, Alara. I believe in you." His phone rang. It was David. "The board has moved up the vote of no confidence," David said, his voice grim. It's in 1 hour. They're going to remove you as CEO, Julian. Marcus has the votes. It's over. Julian looked at the market data on his screen. The shipping sector stocks were holding steady, even rising slightly in defiance of their bet. The world thought they were fools. The clock was ticking. He had staked everything. His company, his legacy, his belief in her on a whisper. And now the world was roaring back, threatening to drown them both. The hour that followed was the longest of Julian Thorne's life. He and Alara sat in his office, the door closed, watching the screens in silence. The noise from the trading floor was a dull roar, the sound of his empire crumbling. On the television, financial news channels were in a feeding frenzy, with expert after expert denouncing his unprecedented and reckless gamble. They showed pictures of Alara, grainy photos taken from her employee file, next to glamorous shots of Julian. The invisible woman had been made visible, but only to be burned at the stake. Every few minutes, David would send a text. The board is assembling, Marcus is giving his speech. They're preparing the ballots. Each message was another nail in the coffin. The market remained stubbornly defiant. The stocks they had shorted were stable. The catastrophe Alara had predicted refused to materialize. Doubt, a cold and creeping poison, began to seep into the room. Julian kept his face a mask of calm, but Alara could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed silently on the arm of his chair. She felt a crushing weight of guilt. She had seen the pattern. She had read the language. She was so sure. But what if she had been arrogant? What if her gift was just a delusion? A fantasy concocted by a lonely woman who wanted to believe she was special. She looked at Julian, at this powerful man who had risked everything for her, and her heart ached. The vote was happening now. In the boardroom down the hall, Marcus Vance was likely delivering the eulogy for Julian's career. It was over. And then, a single red alert flashed in the corner of a screen. It was a small news wire notification from a maritime authority in Singapore. Strait of Malacca closed due to unforeseen collision involving container ship, the Leviathan. Alara's breath caught in her throat. The Leviathan. It was one of the over-leveraged companies she had identified. The Strait of Malacca was the bottleneck. It was the gust of wind. Julian saw it at the same moment. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on the screen. For a second, nothing happened. The market digested the news. Then the first flicker of red appeared. A single shipping stock dipped. Then another. And another. It was a trickle, then a stream, then a flood. A wave of panic selling hit the sector. The stable, boring stocks that everyone had ignored began to plummet. Down 5%. Down 10%. Down 30%. The house of cards was collapsing, exactly as she had said it would. The heart attack was happening. On the trading floor, the roar of panic was replaced by a collective gasp of stunned disbelief. The traders stared at their screens, their faces pale with shock. They weren't just watching a market correction. They were watching a legend being born. Julian's phone buzzed. It was David. The text was short. Vote suspended. They're watching the market. Julian allowed himself a small, grim smile. He stood up and walked to the door, pulling it open. The noise from the floor washed over them. He looked at Alara, his eyes blazing with triumph and something else, something deeper. He held out his hand. "Come," he said. "Let's watch the story end." They walked out onto the mezzanine overlooking the trading floor. Below them, a sea of traders was in motion, but all their activity was a reaction to the event they had set in motion. Julian and Alara stood alone, the calm center of the storm they had created. And as the numbers on the big board bled red, confirming a profit so immense it would be talked about for decades, Julian knew he hadn't just saved his company. He had found its future. The investigation was swift and merciless. An audit of phone records and network activity led directly from the tabloid journalist back to Marcus Vance. The betrayal was laid bare, undeniable. Julian fired him personally, not with anger, but with a cold, quiet finality that was far more devastating. Marcus left the building stripped of his power, his reputation, and his future, a ghost haunting the empire he had tried to steal. The world, which had been so quick to condemn, was now even quicker to praise. The headlines that had called Julian a madman now hailed him as a visionary. The woman they had mocked as a charismatic cleaner was now the Oracle of Thorn, a mysterious genius with a Midas touch. They clamored for interviews, for her story, for the secret to her gift. But Alara remained hidden from the public eye, sheltered within the walls of the firm. She was no longer an invisible woman, but she was not yet ready for the blinding spotlight. Her bonus, the impossible sum of $5 million, was transferred to her account. The first thing she did was pay off every one of her mother's medical bills and hire the best team of doctors in the country. For the first time in a decade, she could breathe. She could sleep without the crushing weight of debt on her chest. The money was life-changing, but the true change had happened within her. She walked through the halls of Thorn Investments not as a cleaner, but as a queen in a borrowed suit. The traders who had once smirked at her now averted their eyes or offered respectful nods. They knew she could see things they couldn't. She held a power that their money and degrees couldn't buy. One evening, a month after the great bet, Julian found her on the mezzanine, looking down at the now quiet trading floor. "I've been looking for you," he said. She turned, a soft smile on her face. The tired, haunted look was gone from her eyes. In its place was a quiet confidence that was more beautiful than any jewel. "I came to say goodbye," she said softly. "My contract is up." Julian's smile faded. "I was hoping we could make it permanent. I've created a new position, Chief Strategy Analyst, head of our new division of Narrative Analytics. Your own team, your own terms." Alara looked at him, her heart full. It was everything she could have ever dreamed of. A title, respect, a future. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I think I'm done reading other people's stories for a while. I think I need to write my own." Julian nodded, a look of understanding on his face. He knew he couldn't cage a spirit like hers. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in my life, I get to choose." He stepped closer, the space between them charged with all the unspoken things that had passed between them in the crucible of the last month. "My father," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "He built this empire by being ruthless, by trusting only the numbers. I spent my whole life trying to be him, the Ice King, but I was just a ghost in his castle. You taught me that the numbers are only half the story. You taught me how to listen." He looked out at the panoramic view of the city, the endless lights glittering like fallen stars. "I don't want to be the Ice King anymore." He turned back to her, his gaze intense and sincere. "Stay, Alara. Not as an analyst. Not as an employee. Stay with me." It wasn't a proposition. It was a plea. He took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. In his touch, she felt not the entitlement of a billionaire, but the vulnerability of a man who had been just as invisible as she was, trapped in a different kind of poverty. She had read the language of markets, the stories of corporations, the secrets of the global economy. But the story she saw in his eyes was the one that mattered most. It was a story of two lonely people who had found each other in the dark. A story of a king who had given up his crown, and a cleaner who had found her throne. "Okay, Julian," she whispered, her fingers lacing with his. "Okay." They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, no longer a boss and his employee, but partners, equals. Together, they looked out at the city, not as a kingdom to be conquered, but as a world of infinite stories waiting to be written. And so, we ask you again, what is the greatest treasure in the world? It is the gift hidden inside you, the unique way you see the world, the language that only you can speak. Too often, we are told to be quiet, to fit in, to erase the very things that make us special. But what if your secret, your anomaly, your grammatical error, is the key to unlocking everything? What if the world is just waiting for you to pick up the marker and make your mark? Look around you. The person you overlook every day might just be the one who can change your world. And maybe, just maybe, that person is you. What is your hidden gift? Tell us your story in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they are not invisible.